I ended up, while doing Submission Underground, okay, and I won't tell you who this conversation was with, but I ended up in the process of putting this together in a discussion about the UFC and the antitrust lawsuit. And these fascinate me because they are made by the most simpleton, the most basic of thinkers. But there's a lot of them. And there's power in numbers. And if you can get a whole bunch of people together that don't have their thinking cap on, you can start to get a whole bunch of voices, and all of a sudden you got to go address something, right? I mean, it's just the way of the world. Then you got to go address something. So I sit back in these situations. I do a little bit more talking, a little bit more listening than I do talking. But I got a couple of these knuckleheads in front of me, and they're pleading their case for me. And they're saying things like, this is not how major sports are done. And they start talking about the NBA and the NFL, and they start talking about hockey, and they start talking about baseball. And they tell me how sports are done. And the UFC is not doing things the way that sports are done. And I just sit back and listen, and I never take the time to correct them. But inside, of course, because I'm a little bit more of a sophisticated thinker, I'm thinking, I haven't the foggiest idea what your point is. Are you attempting to compare Dana White to sports guys? Because if you are, I want to know where you get that basis from. The only basis that you would have to possibly compare Dana White to other sports guys is the fact that Dana White comes out and tells you he's in sports. Dana was a little kid once. That might surprise some of you. He was a young man one time that aspired to grow up and do something. Guess what that was? Those aspirations happened to be in the fight game. Now that changed over time. First, he wanted to be a fighter himself, wanted to be a competitive fighter himself. Then he said, you know what, I want to be a manager on this. Then he goes, you know what, let's take over the whole damn thing. So you might have heard, possibly even from Dana himself, that he is in the sports business. But you will not hear from any legal mind out there or any objective thinker out there that he's in the sports business or ever has been in the sports business or can be compared to anybody else in the business of sport. From unions to collective bargaining to rights to distribution to phenomenally and exponentially different merchandising deals. There's nothing about that you're going to compare other sport with this one. Nothing. And he can tell you till he's blue in the face he's in sports. He's not. He's an executive producer of content. And you could put the business practices that he does against any other executive producer of content from the beginning of time to present time and for the rest of time. And it is 100% hand in hand. 100%. With a slight caveat that early in his career, perhaps before he smartened up, in fairness, perhaps he eventually got a little bit better advice. But at one point in his career, he allowed his talent, who he hired and paid, to go out and get their own sponsors and keep 100% of the revenue. That never should have been done. Guys, I am on the boys' side. I stand with the guys in the locker room. I do not stand with the corporation. But I also stand in the world of objectiveness and fairness. There is no executive producer of content in the history of time that allows his paid talent to go out and get their own sponsors. Should anybody ever do that? Should Martin Scorsese one day do that? Should Bruce Burnett someday go out and do that? Which they won't. Should they in a hypothetical world? If we could ask those guys right now, should Steven Spielberg go out there and do that? He will be taking a cut. And believe me, he will be taking the lion's share. But if you come to him and say, hey, I got this deal and it's all mine and I'd really like to do it, he's going to go, great. You take 20%, you bring me 80 and go ahead and wear that watch in my next movie. That's the way that's going to go. In an absolute best case scenario, of which isn't even going to happen, that was the one thing. So when he finally lined up with other executive producers of content, he had to take that away. I've never seen anybody more guilty of the expression, no good deed goes unpunished. I just simply never seen it. Guys, I work on ESPN. If I took a suit deal, okay, if I had a suit company come to me and say, Chael, we will pay you X amount of dollars as long as you wear our suits on ESPN. And I do a side deal with them that I do not bring to my boss at ESPN. I will be out the door so goddamn fast my head would spin. And if I tried to contact any attorney for wrongful termination, they would hang the phone up on me so fast. I can't really express to you guys, you cannot do that. And for a part of his career, I'm talking about Dana, he let guys do that. I do hear on this argument of the antitrust. So many things, but they're in left field and they continue to compare it to other sports. They need to compare the business of the UFC for what it is and to other like-minded and equal businesses and check those practices. I've heard the word monopoly thrown out. Guys, there is executive producers of content every 15 feet in certain cities in this world. You happen to be talking to one right now. By the way, I produce this content. You happen to see it on every channel, on every digital, on every platform, on every radio station, on every podcast out there. In cities like California, in cities like New York, it is not the exception, it is the norm to see executive producers of content. And if you compare their business models to the executive producers of content, the UFC, it's absolutely in line. But somewhere people have tried to take this off script and say, oh, no. This is sport. And football sport. And baseball sport. And we're seeing some irregularities. Now, I'm not sure you'd even be right on that, but I've never spent 2 seconds delving into that. I'm not a huge sports guy. In fairness, I've just never explored that avenue because you're not making the right comparison. How do you monopolize something that a million other people do? And some of them even busier. Some of them even bigger. So then you try to minimize it down and go, okay, well, it's specifically the sport of MMA. The sport of MMA, I don't fully know what that means. There's 50 different definitions within this country alone. Each state sets up their own definition. It is not like any of those other sports that are in the mainstream at all whatsoever. It is regulated by the government. So I guess we could go out and get 50 different opinions. But as far as a monopolization of a sport that 50 different entities just within this country alone regulate, proclaim, policy, rule, provide, that's a stretch for me. If you want to compare businesses and compare what's fair, you take one executive director of content and compare him to another executive director of content. And this is some of the fun that I've got to have while working on Submission Underground. Because I got to sit on a lot of phone calls with a lot of people who I would like to smarten up. Sometimes I just don't have the time and I don't have the energy and I really don't care about them, but I do care about you all.